What happens inside a mind that transforms isolation into ideology and ideology into mass murder? In the summer of 2011, Norway was shattered by an act of violence that seemed almost unimaginable. Anders Behring Breivik, a man in his early 30s with no prior criminal history, carried out one of the deadliest attacks in modern European history. After detonating a car bomb in the government quarter of Oslo, killing 8, he traveled to the island of Utøya, where he methodically hunted and murdered 69 people, most of them teenagers. The horror of that day stunned a peaceful nation, but the deeper shock came from realizing that this wasn't the work of a chaotic mind, but of one chillingly methodical. Who was this man? What psychological forces shaped a killer who believed he was saving his country through mass execution? And more importantly, could anyone have seen this coming? Have you ever wondered what truly drives a mind like this? Stay with me. The truths we're about to uncover go deeper than you might expect. This is not a story about what he did. It's a journey into why. And to understand the why, we must go back, long before the manifesto, long before the gunshots echoed across Utøya. We begin with a childhood not marked by violence, but by absence. A childhood that may have built the silent architecture of everything that followed. Breivik's early years reveal not a single moment of obvious collapse, but a slow erosion, one that unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. Raised in a fractured home, his father absent by choice and his mother emotionally unstable, Anders grew up surrounded not by chaos, but by coldness. The absence of nurturing, of true emotional connection, didn't leave scars, it left voids. And those voids, over time, became the perfect breeding ground for resentment, grandiosity, and detachment. He was not violently abused, he was profoundly unseen. This subtle form of neglect can be more corrosive than we often admit, quietly dismantling a child's ability to trust, to relate, to belong. Have you ever recognized fragments of these patterns in ordinary people? Share your perception. Your voice matters here. And if you're drawn to deep psychological inquiry, not easy narratives, this space was made for you. Check if you're already subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked and join our journey into the minds we fear to understand. As we move forward, the picture begins to sharpen. The lonely boy becomes a withdrawn adolescent, his social world collapsing into near non-existence. Friendships fade, empathy thins, but beneath the silence, something begins to grow. A worldview built on rejection and a deep hunger for identity. From this quiet void, Anders starts constructing a self-image not based on connection, but on control. Anders Breivik was not forged in chaos, but in emptiness, a far more insidious kind of damage. His father, Jens Breivik, distanced himself early, not through violence, but through indifference. He made it clear in custody reports that he did not wish contact with his son if it would bring problems. That sentence alone, sterile, dismissive, final, was a fracture that never healed. His mother, Vensche, was described in psychiatric evaluations as emotionally unstable and possibly suffering from borderline personality traits. She reportedly oscillated between overprotection and cold detachment, at times infantilizing Anders, and at others expressing disturbing ambivalence toward his existence. These weren't dramatic moments of abuse, but quiet, repeated distortions of attachment. They created a psychological vacuum. By age 4, social services were already recommending that Anders be removed from his mother's care due to concerns about her mental health and the quality of the attachment bond. But no action was taken. He remained in that emotionally barren environment where affection came conditional, if it came at all. The consequences of this early neglect echoed throughout his development, in his inability to form lasting friendships, in his increasing withdrawal from peers, and most crucially, in his growing need to invent an identity that gave him significance where life had denied him connection. But there's another hidden layer we need to uncover. How these subtle emotional wounds hardened into a rigid, grandiose self-image. a transformation not marked by sudden breaks, but by a slow, relentless departure from empathy, intimacy, and reality itself. If this analysis sparked something inside you, leave in the comments. There's always a hidden layer. And as Breivik moved through adolescence, the void left by emotional neglect deepened into something more dangerous. Isolation so complete, it began to distort his very perception of the world. Former classmates described him as distant, socially awkward, often withdrawn, and uninterested in connection. He wasn't bullied, nor was he openly antagonistic. He simply faded from social spaces, becoming a ghost among his peers. His sense of identity, already fragile, now depended on detachment from institutions, from norms, from people. And slowly, that detachment became a form of control. If he couldn't belong, he would redefine what it meant to matter. He drifted between short-lived attempts at education and failed business ventures, each collapse reinforcing a narrative of being misunderstood and rejected. This wasn't just loneliness. It was the construction of an internal world where everyone else was either irrelevant or complicit in a larger betrayal. He began writing online under pseudonyms, exploring far-right forums, and gravitating toward extremist ideologies that validated his growing resentment. These digital communities didn't simply reinforce his views. They gave him a mirror in which his growing bitterness looked righteous. The trial would later reveal a crucial line from Breivik's 1,500-page manifesto: "I don't hate Muslims, but I hate the values of Islam." That distinction, carefully crafted, reflects the psychological distance he maintained, not just from others, but from the consequences of his own decisions. This wasn't a man consumed by spontaneous rage. It was someone who had spent years erasing the emotional bridges that connect human beings to one another. Now let's go even deeper into this, because the transformation was far from complete. Identity, for Breivik, wasn't just a shield against rejection. It would become a weapon, forged through delusion and precision, to reshape his place in a world he no longer felt part of. As Breivik's isolation deepened, so too did his need to construct an identity that would shield him from insignificance. But this wasn't merely a psychological coping mechanism. It became a full-scale transformation of self, driven by two powerful forces: narcissism and paranoia. Psychiatric evaluations during his trial revealed grandiose delusions anchored in a rigid belief that he had been chosen to carry out a historic mission. In his own words, he referred to himself as the most perfect knight since World War II. This wasn't metaphor. It was a core component of how he saw himself and his role in the world. His paranoia, however, gave that grandiosity direction. He came to believe that Europe was under attack, not in a literal war zone, but through cultural erosion, political betrayal, and what he described as Islamic colonization. These beliefs didn't emerge in a vacuum. Breivik consumed conspiracy theories obsessively, reinforcing the idea that traditional elites were orchestrating the downfall of Western civilization. He wasn't simply building an identity, he was building an enemy, an entire imagined network of threats that justified his growing sense of urgency. In the courtroom, when asked if he regretted the murder of 77 people, Breivik remained emotionless. He claimed that the victims, many of them teenagers, were legitimate political targets. This statement wasn't just cold, it was revealing. It exposed the extent to which narcissism had severed his connection to empathy, and how paranoia had framed reality in absolutes. He was righteous. They were dangerous. There was no middle ground. The complexity of this mind doesn't end here, because once the delusion is complete and the identity is sealed, the final decision is no longer whether to act, but how. That's the next layer we must now examine. Breivik's descent didn't culminate in a spontaneous act of violence. It unfolded through a carefully constructed ideology that gave purpose to his psychosis. He immersed himself in far-right literature, conspiracy forums, and manifestos written by other extremists. But what he took from these sources wasn't simply political rhetoric. He used ideology as scaffolding, a way to organize the chaos within him into something that felt structured, noble, even heroic. This transformation was not accidental. He filtered every belief through the lens of his grandiose identity, selecting only the ideas that confirmed his perceived role as Europe's last defender. His 500-page manifesto, distributed just before the attacks, reads like a twisted symphony of borrowed fears and personalized rage. It's not just political, it's theatrical. He included fabricated military ranks, invented organizational charts for a so-called Knights Templar, and even instructions for future operatives, none of which were grounded in reality. This wasn't a political document. It was a performance of control, a final act of self-validation. Ideology didn't radicalize him. It reflected him. The danger wasn't just what he believed, but how he used belief as a mirror for his own delusions of power. During the trial, Breivik described his attack as cruel but necessary. He claimed it was preventive self-defense on behalf of European identity. But that language, cold, abstract, moralizing, was designed to hide something far more raw, a fractured man clinging to fantasy to escape insignificance. The ideological frame wasn't the cause, it was the costume. Now let's go even deeper into this journey, because once the mind is aligned with a purpose, the preparation begins. And in Breivik's case, that preparation would be disturbingly meticulous. July 22nd, 2011 was not the eruption of chaos. It was the final act in a long psychological preparation executed with clinical precision. After detonating a bomb in Oslo's government quarter, killing 8 and injuring dozens, Breivik drove to Utoya Island, disguised as a police officer. There, over the course of 72 harrowing minutes, he methodically hunted down and murdered 69 people, most of them teenagers attending a political youth camp. Survivors recall how he moved slowly, deliberately, reloading without urgency, calling out to victims pretending to help them, only to shoot them at close range. This was not frenzy. It was ritualized violence, detached and strategic. In his own words, Breivik later said, "I chose Utoya because it represented the next generation of political leaders responsible for multiculturalism." That statement captures the terrifying structure of his mindset. Young lives were not lives. They were symbols, pieces on a board he had appointed himself to clear. The psychopathy here doesn't lie only in the violence, but in the absence of internal conflict. No hesitation, no emotional fracture, just purpose. The victim's humanity had been erased long before he stepped onto that island. In his mental landscape, they had already ceased to exist as individuals. During his trial, he described feeling sad that he didn't go further, that the death toll wasn't higher. His only regret was logistical. This level of detachment reveals a truth many resist. When empathy is entirely absent, the mind can reconfigure horror into heroism. And when identity fuses with mission, killing becomes not a choice, but a perceived obligation. Now we face a final, unsettling question. How does a system respond to such a mind? What kind of justice can reach someone who feels none? That's where we turn next, into the aftermath and the sentence that still divides a nation. When the trial of Anders Behring Breivik began in April 2012, the courtroom became more than a place of judgment. It became a psychological theater. Breivik, seated confidently, showed no remorse. He smiled at times. He raised his arm in a far-right salute. He referred to the massacre as a necessary sacrifice and insisted he would do it again. These weren't empty provocations. They were calculated affirmations of the identity he had built: warrior, martyr, ideologue. The court faced not just a man who had killed, but a man who still believed he was right. Psychiatrists were divided. One evaluation diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Another concluded he was sane, but with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. In the end, the court declared him criminally responsible, sentencing him to 21 years, Norway's maximum penalty, with the possibility of indefinite extensions if deemed a continuing threat. That clause is crucial. It doesn't promise redemption. It acknowledges the permanence of psychological danger. Still, the verdict sparked national and international debate. Could such a sentence, however extendable, ever reflect the scale of the horror inflicted? Inside prison, Breivik has remained unrepentant. He has sued the state multiple times over what he called inhumane conditions, including restrictions on his communications. In 2016, a court initially ruled in his favor, a decision later overturned. Even behind bars, the performance continues. He writes, he appeals, he provokes. Reform has never entered the equation. The mind that carried out Utoya remains intact, sealed in its own logic. So we are left to ask, what kind of justice exists for a mind built on delusion and devoid of remorse? When a sentence acknowledges risk but cannot promise transformation, does it serve the victims or merely contain the threat? Some minds do not seek rehabilitation. They demand reflection, and that's what we're left with. Not closure, but a challenge. If this kind of deep psychological analysis resonates with you, if you're drawn to questioning rather than judging, consider subscribing to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. Every week, we explore a different criminal mind, not to shock, but to understand the fractures, influences, and transformations that shape human darkness. Your insight matters. Right below, the labyrinth never ends. Let's make this a space for reflection, not reaction. And if this exploration into Breivik's psyche brought you clarity or deeper questions, a like helps this kind of serious, thoughtful content reach others who seek more than just headlines. The human mind remains an endless labyrinth, and every case we explore reveals how fragile the line between reality and distortion can be. In our next journey, we'll dive into another mind shaped by forces just as hidden, just as powerful. I'll be here, waiting for you in the next video.